You know, we usually assume the 21st century global chessboard is driven by, brand new theories and cutting-edge tech. But what if I told you the engine powering one of today's fastest-rising superpowers is actually a 2,000-year-old playbook? Welcome to another explainer. Today, we're exploring how India's recent explosion onto the world stage, which impacts literally everything from the global economy to the digital infrastructure you and I use every single day, is actually deeply rooted in ancient wisdom.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly is a 2 millennia-old text shaping modern global geopolitics? Well, the answer lies in the Arthashastra. It was written by the ancient Indian philosopher Kautilya, and it's basically a 2,000-year-old guide to statecraft. Right now, it's acting as the hidden blueprint for India's modern foreign policy. Because as global politics gets more polarized and, frankly, a lot more uncertain, India is looking back to this exact text to navigate its future. They're transforming from a state of really cautious diplomacy into a confident, highly proactive global player.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the ancient realist playbook. Then we'll break down the 4 pillars: Sama, which is attraction; Dana, generosity; Bheda, strategic balance; and Danda, deterrence. Finally, we'll wrap up by seeing how this all creates a complete smart power synthesis.
Okay, let's start by defining our terms here. We're talking about Kautilyan Realism and the Chaturvidha Upaya, or the 4 methods. This is a strategic doctrine that ruthlessly prioritizes Rashtra Hita, which translates to national interest. For a long time after independence, India leaned really heavily on abstract moralism in its foreign policy. But recently, we've seen a definitive pivot. It's a major shift toward calculated pragmatism, where keeping the state safe and influential totally takes precedence over pure ideology.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how scholars actually view Kautilya's historical weight. Look at this quote from Roger Boshi. He calls Kautilya the world's first great political realist, putting him right up there with, or honestly even ahead of, Western heavyweights like Thucydides or Machiavelli. I mean, Kautilya wasn't out here writing poetry, right? He was writing a ruthless, pragmatic survival guide for empires.
To really see this in a modern context, we can contrast 2 very distinct eras of Indian statecraft. Pre-2014, India's approach was often labeled as strategic hesitation. Think of it kind of like a tortoise, slower, very cautious. But the era from 2014 to 2026, that's defined by an eagle-like strategic autonomy. Experts are actually calling this the Neo-Kautilyan era. This is where India steps out, not just as a regional actor, but actively seeking to be a leading power on its own unapologetic terms.
And that brings us perfectly to our first Kautilyan pillar, Sama, the art of attraction.
Notice how the ancient concept has completely transformed. Ancient Sama meant conciliation. Often it was just about appeasing adversaries to keep the peace. But modern Sama, it translates perfectly to the concept of soft power. It's all about global branding and sharing civilizational assets. India uses its incredible cultural heritage not just as a history lesson, but as a very deliberate strategic tool to build a civilizational state that naturally attracts the rest of the world, rather than forcing them into anything.
So what does this actually look like in action? Well, it's a multi-pronged offensive of attraction. Culturally, you've got massive global events like International Yoga Day, establishing deep connections, especially across Asia. Politically, they leverage a vast diaspora as a huge strategic lobby. Think of those massive stadium events like Howdy Modi. Diplomatically, they use their G20 presidency to push the narrative of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the idea that the world is one family. And technologically, by exporting their digital public infrastructure, India's proving its tech can be a soft power tool dedicated to global service. The whole strategy is about projecting what they call strategic comfort.
At its core, this philosophy treats the entire global community like an interconnected ecosystem of growth and care. By deploying Sama, India is aiming to establish a realist cultural hegemony. Essentially, the goal is to evolve from just quietly following international rules to becoming a highly confident rule maker at the global table.
But here's the thing, soft power and attraction only get you so far. Eventually, you have to put your money where your mouth is. So let's move to the second pillar, Dana, diplomacy through generosity.
So the crucial point is how this ancient idea has been upgraded. Ancient Dana was literally giving gifts to appease enemies or secure allies.
Modern Dana, though, is structured around really robust developmental partnerships. It's not just handing out cash randomly. It's a calculated moral framework purposely designed to build deep global trust and guarantee regional stability. India is shifting from being a seeker state to a proactive donor state.
The real-world application of this builds some incredible momentum. Just look at 2022, when Sri Lanka faced a completely crippling economic crisis. India didn't just sit back and watch from the sidelines. No, they deployed $4 billion in emergency aid, fuel, and medicine. Over in Afghanistan, they literally built the parliament building and crucial dams. And when terrifying international disasters strike, like the earthquake in Turkey and Syria or the cyclone in Myanmar, India rapidly launches massive humanitarian missions. They are methodically building an image as the world's indispensable first responder.
And then there's this incredible number, 163 million. That is the massive number of vaccine doses that India sent out to over 100 countries during the pandemic under their Vaccine Maitri initiative. Talk about scale. This is literally the ultimate synthesis of Kautilyan generosity meeting desperate modern humanitarian needs. On top of that, India's line of credit portfolio has ballooned to nearly $30 billion, stretching all the way across South Asia to Africa and the Pacific. Geopolitical analysts point to this as a wildly strategic move. Why? Because it positions India's developmental diplomacy as a transparent, sustainable alternative to the debt trap diplomacy you often see from other global powers. And for you and me, this ultimately means more stable global markets and much more diversified supply chains.
All right, now we enter the third and honestly probably the most complex pillar, Bheda, mastering strategic balance. Ancient Bheda literally meant creating divisions and rifts among your enemies to weaken them. Sounds pretty ruthless, right? Well, modern Bheda has evolved into the incredibly sophisticated practice of multi-alignment and asymmetric hedging. Instead of getting locked into exclusive, rigid blocks like we saw back in the Cold War, India very deftly navigates the rifts between competing superpowers to protect its own interests.
And this brilliantly illustrates what walking a geopolitical tightrope looks like in practice. India secures the Indo-Pacific by partnering with the US in the Quad, while at the exact same time maintaining huge defense contracts with Russia, like the S-400 missile systems. They champion new trade routes like the IMAC corridor to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, all while perfectly balancing delicate, complex ties between Israel and Arab nations. Plus, they strategically use international institutions like the FATF to diplomatically isolate adversaries over terrorism. It's the ultimate rule-breaking move in a zero-sum game. They play the middle ground to absolutely maximize their own strategic space.
Political scientist T.V. Paul really hits the nail on the head here. He notes that India acts as a bridging power. See, Bheda isn't malicious here. In a multipolar world full of competing giants, utilizing the distances between various poles is just a vital survival mechanism. It's exactly what secures true strategic autonomy.
But listen, diplomacy, no matter how clever or how generous, needs a backbone. And that brings us to our fourth and final pillar, Danda, the power of deterrence.
While ancient Danda was all about direct physical punishment and the brute military force of a kingdom, modern Danda is completely different. It translates into a highly sophisticated doctrine of proactive defense and credible deterrence. We're looking at a huge transition from historical warfare to calculated, highly technology-driven military readiness. Over the last decade or so, we've witnessed a really dramatic escalation in how India projects force and draws its red lines. It started with the 2016 surgical strikes and the 2019 Balakot airstrikes, which showed a totally newfound willingness to cross borders to neutralize threats. More recently, in May 2025, they utilized precision strike drones in Operation Sindoor. But they aren't just focused on the borders. They are massively upgrading their nuclear triad. In 2024, they successfully tested the Agni-5 missile with multiple warhead MIRV technology and commissioned the INS Arahat, a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, to completely secure their maritime interests in the Indian Ocean region.
Crucially, though, all this hard power is increasingly homegrown. In the 2024-2025 financial year, India's domestic defense production hit a massive record of 1.51 lakh crore rupees. By heavily investing in indigenous platforms, things like the Teja fighter aircraft and Dhanush artillery, India is making absolutely sure that its hard power deterrence is entirely self-reliant.
Let's move to our summary and see how this all builds together.
When you step back and look at the cohesive whole, combining the cultural attraction of Sama and the developmental trust of Danda, which together make up soft power, and you weave in the strategic maneuvering of Bheda and the proactive defense of Danda, representing hard power, you get true smart power. Kautilya's ancient playbook has literally been seamlessly synthesized into a complete modern doctrine.
Which leaves us with this final, pivotal thought. We've seen how India has used the 4 upayas to transform into a confident global player, striving to be the Vishwa Mitra, a friend to the world, but one armed with a very sharp, realist edge. As global polarization deepens and the geopolitical chessboard becomes incredibly complex, can this perfect blend of 2,000-year-old pragmatism and 21st-century statecraft serve as the eternal DNA for India's success? It's a fascinating question, and understanding this framework gives you exactly what you need to watch it all unfold. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.